There are always accidents in aviation, and within a couple of months, the case is usually solved, and whatever the cause was, new measures are taken so that an accident like that can never happen again. Although, there have been some instances where the cause of the accident is never determined, or even when the aircraft involved is never found. These are some of the times when airplanes have disappeared and have left little to no trace of where they could be or what happened to them. In 1956, off the coast of Algeria in the Mediterranean, 4 Boeing B47 bombers were on a flight carrying 2 capsules of nuclear weapons from Florida's MacDill Air Force Base to Ben Gurion Air Base in Morocco. The planes had gone under aerial refueling and were about to undergo another. The next refuel would be at 14,000 feet, which meant that the bombers had to descend through a cloud. By the time they had descended through the cloud, only 3 of the 4 bombers emerged. Militaries from multiple countries conducted extensive searches, but no aircraft traces could be found. Initial reports stated that one of the nuclear weapons capsules had detonated and the aircraft had exploded, but no remains of the device were discovered. The search was called off and the crew was declared dead. Varig Flight 967 was a Boeing 707 cargo airplane that was carrying 53 paintings that were recently shown at a Tokyo exhibition in 1979. They were altogether worth $1.2 million US. The plane took off from Tokyo's Narita Airport at 8:03 p.m. and rode to Los Angeles International Airport, then take off again to reach its final destination in Rio de Janeiro. 30 minutes after takeoff, the plane lost all radar contact over the Pacific Ocean 120 miles east of Tokyo. No emergency transmission had been received by air traffic control and extensive searches were conducted, but no remains of the plane or any of the paintings were found. There are multiple theories on what could have happened to the plane. The most likely case is the plane suffering sudden depressurization in mid-flight, causing the crew to become hypoxic and therefore unable to control the plane, causing it to spiral and crash. Pakistan International Airlines Flight 404 was a Fokker F27 Friendship that was on a routine flight from Gilgit to Islamabad, carrying 49 passengers and 5 crew members in August 1989. At 7:36, the plane took off from Gilgit Airport and it transmitted its last message at 7:40, when the aircraft would suddenly disappear off the radar. Searches for the aircraft proved unsuccessful and it would eventually be called off. However, there could be an explanation for this disappearance. The route the plane was flying caused it to fly through the Himalayas, one of the harshest mountain ranges in the world. Areas like this are very notorious for hiding airplanes when they somehow disappear and are unable to find. For example, in 1947, a British South American Airways Avro Lancastrian disappeared in the Andes Mountains while on a flight from Buenos Aires to Santiago, and for a while, no traces of the plane were discovered, and the accident remained a mystery until the wreckage was finally found 51 years later in 1998. We may never know if the aircraft's wreckage might still be out there. Even if it was, it would be difficult to find, but as of today, the cause of Flight 404 remains a mystery. Irene 92, an RC-135 Rivet Amber, was en route from Shemya to Eielson Air Force Base on June 15, 1969 to undergo routine maintenance. While the plane was in the air, the crew reported feeling some kind of vibration in the plane, but all the systems said it was fine. Later, a transmission was received that suggested the crew was donning oxygen. Following a series of radio clicks, all contact with the plane would be lost. After 3 weeks of searching and not a trace of the plane found, the military abandoned trying to find it. It was the only plane of its type to be built, and it had installed one of the latest radar systems in it, costing about $35 million and powered at 7 megawatts. In 1962, a Lockheed Constellation operating under Flying Tiger Line was transporting U.S. military soldiers to South Vietnam's capital of Saigon, where they would relieve soldiers who were training South Vietnamese troops to fight Viet Cong guerrillas. The aircraft departed from Guam and was headed to the Philippines, where it would then continue to Saigon. During the time the plane was in the air, Guam's communication system was temporarily suffering difficulties with frequent heavy static on the radio. When this issue was resolved, one of the radio operators attempted to contact the plane, but did not receive a response. It was at that moment that no transmissions or sightings of the plane were ever seen again. At first, people suspected that maybe it was something with the weather, but weather conditions that day were clear and calm. The U.S. Navy, Air Force, Coast Guard, and Marines were all involved in the extensive 8-day search, but no traces of any airplane parts or bodies were found. The tanker ship, SSTL Lincoln, was in the area at the time of the aircraft's disappearance and reported seeing a bright flash, bright enough to be seen from the ship's decks, which was followed by 2 red lights falling out of the sky. When crew members of the ship were interviewed, they claimed that they witnessed the 2 red lights fall into the ocean and immediately turned the ship into the area where the fireballs had impacted. But like the 8-day search, not a trace was found. Regardless, this could conclude that the aircraft suffered an in-flight explosion, but due to a lack of evidence of the cause or any other witnesses at the time, the exact fate couldn't be determined and today remains a mystery. Now the top 3 are some of the most highly controversial disappearances of airplanes whose causes are still debated to this day, and right at number 3 is N844AA. N844AA was a retired Boeing 727-200 that was formerly operated by American Airlines, and in the early 2000s, it had been transported to Luanda, Angola to be given to IRS Airlines. The man who owned the plane, Keith Irwin, had left Angola after an unknown man would follow him around to the point where he had to blockade his hotel room door handle with a chair. The plane was left there for 14 months before Irwin sent one of his colleagues, Ben Padilla, to repossess the plane. When Padilla showed up, the plane had been racking up parking fees and fines and was looking in a very bad state for the last 14 months. Padilla hired a local mechanic crew to refurbish the aircraft, and after some time, the plane was good enough to be sent to a new client in Johannesburg. On the 25th of May 2003, however, the aircraft was powered up and taxied to the runway with no communication between the cockpit and ATC, despite ATC's efforts to contact the plane. The plane proceeded to line up with the runway and take off. When it took off, its transponder and lights were off, making it impossible for any control tower to track it. The people who were piloting it were Padilla and an unknown mechanic, which is odd as a 727 needs a total of 3 crew members to pilot it. Extensive searches were conducted by the FBI and U.S. State Department, but no traces of evidence could be found of the plane on land or in the sea. The most common theory that many people believe is that someone came into the 727 unnoticed, held Padilla and the mechanic at gunpoint, forced them to take off, and presumably crash it. Even to this day, not one conclusion or shred of evidence can piece together what happened to N844AA that fateful night. You may know this woman, Amelia Earhart. She's most known for being the first woman to fly across the Atlantic Ocean. At the time, this was her second attempt at flying around the world. She, along with her radio operator, Fred Noonan, would use a Lockheed Model 10 Electra and fly to over 60 locations that spanned across the entire continental globe, making her the first person to fly across the world. Earhart began her journey on May 20, 1937, and the first 58 trips were relatively uneventful. On July 2, 1937, Earhart took off from Lae, New Guinea en route to Howland Island. At one point, during the flight, Earhart claimed the clouds were thick and began to descend to a lower altitude. The ship that the plane was communicating with, the USCGC Itasca, was suffering technical difficulties in their radio communications. When Earhart was 200 miles away from the ship, she said, "Get ready for us." She meant that the plane was going to fly over the ship and use a direction finder, which the ship would use to direct the plane. More issues with the radio occurred up to the point when there was nothing but silence, and at that moment, the plane was never heard from again. After 10 days and 250,000 square miles covered, not a trace of the plane or crew was found. Now, the Amelia Earhart rabbit hole is so deep that it's impossible to cover in a few minutes, so you'll have to refer to these 3 videos by the infographics show Thoughty2 and Mr. Ballin for a more in-depth analysis. But basically, the main theory behind Amelia Earhart's disappearance is, after their last transmission, they ran out of fuel and crashed on probably Nikamaruru Island. Noonan probably died on impact while Earhart was badly injured and exits the plane. She then survives with the little rations she has on her, but in her weakened state, and still bleeding, she attracted the island's coconut crabs, who killed and ate her. Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 was a Boeing 777-200 that was on a routine flight from Kuala Lumpur to Beijing on March 8, 2014, with 227 passengers and 12 other crew members on board. After the plane reached its cruising altitude, it was transferred from Lumpur Radio to Ho Chi Minh Area Control Center. Their last vocal transmission was, "Good night, Malaysian 370," at 1:19 a.m. A minute later, its Mode S symbol disappeared from Kuala Lumpur's radar screens. Moments later, it completely disappears from the radar screens of both Kuala Lumpur and Ho Chi Minh. The only tracking that the plane would be seen on at that time is military radar. The plane then makes a turn to the right and then left and goes completely off course. 10 minutes after the plane disappeared off the radar, another plane tries to make contact with Flight 370 and is successful, but claimed to have only heard static mumbling. An airport in Kota Baru picked up an unidentified plane on their radar, which was most likely Flight 370, but no transmissions were made. The aircraft was spotted a few more times before making another turn northwest. Its last known location was 438 kilometers northwest of Penang Airport at an altitude of 29,500 feet at 2:22 a.m. 6 hours later, after a series of handshakes, its final transmission was a log-on acknowledgement which was incomplete. The multinational search for the aircraft became the largest at 120,000 square miles and the most expensive, but not a shred of evidence was found, and was eventually called off on July 8, 2018. A few pieces of debris have washed up on the shores, but none were enough to help determine what happened to the aircraft. A multitude of theories have been made, and it would be impossible to cover them all in this video, but the prime suspect that Malaysian authorities put this on is Captain Shah, stating that he depressurized the cabin to make all the passengers unconscious, flew the airplane off course, and let it starve of fuel until it crashed. Even today, after 8 years, the plane still earns the title of aviation's greatest mystery.